Hi.
Our story unfolds in the breathtaking embrace of the mountains, where the air is thin, crisp, and carries a promise of something unspoken. I had decided to take a break from the city with Mark, my adopted son, now 21 and navigating the complexities of adulthood. The campsites nestled in these hills were our favorite retreat, a place where we could escape the noise of our everyday lives and reconnect under the starlit sky. From the outside, we probably looked like any other pair of travelers, mother and son, enjoying the serene beauty of nature. But lately, there had been a shift between us, an undercurrent I couldn't quite name, one that seemed to pulse beneath our usual interactions. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just my imagination. Yet here, away from the distractions of daily life, it became harder to ignore. We set up our tent by a pristine lake surrounded by towering pine trees. The sun dipped low, casting golden hues over the water. As the day turned to dusk, we sat by the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on Mark's face. He had grown into a striking young man, strong, confident, yet carrying an air of melancholy that often reminded me of the time we first met, when he was just a boy, lost and scared. "I missed this," he said, breaking the silence, his eyes fixed on the fire. "It's been too long since we've done something like this." I smiled, feeling a pang of nostalgia. "It has. You're so busy these days. College, friends, your own life." Mark glanced at me then, something unreadable in his expression. "You're still a part of my life, Mom. You know that, right?" The way he said it, soft, almost vulnerable, made my heart clench. I nodded, unable to find the right words. There was an intensity in his gaze, one that made me look away, focusing on the flames instead. Later that night, as the temperature dropped, we retreated into the tent. It was a small, cozy space meant for two. I crawled into my sleeping bag, but sleep wouldn't come. I could hear Mark's steady breathing beside me, the sound strangely comforting and yet unsettling at the same time. "Are you awake?" he whispered, his voice cutting through the silence. "Yes," I replied, turning to face him. In the dim light, I could barely make out his features, but I could feel the weight of his gaze. "I've been thinking," he started, then paused as if weighing his words. "About us." The statement hung in the air, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to acknowledge. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my tone light, though my pulse quickened. He reached out, his hand finding mine in the dark. The touch was gentle, yet it sent a jolt through me, an electric charge that felt entirely inappropriate. I should have pulled away, made a joke to diffuse the moment, but I couldn't bring myself to move. "I feel closer to you here," he murmured. "More than anywhere else." I swallowed hard, searching for the right response, but none came. His thumb brushed over the back of my hand, a small, almost innocent gesture, yet it sent my thoughts spiraling. "We've always been close," I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange, even to me. "Not like this," he whispered, and the raw honesty in his tone left me breathless. I pulled my hand back then, breaking the connection. "Mark, this isn't right. We're family." He was quiet for a long moment, and I thought I'd ended whatever strange conversation we were having. But then he spoke again, his voice barely audible. "I know you feel it too, Mom." The word Mom hit me like a cold splash of water, reminding me of who we were supposed to be. I sat up, my hands trembling slightly. It's the closeness of the moment, the isolation," I said, more to myself than to him. "We're out here, away from everything. It's easy to confuse emotions." He sat up as well, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I've felt this way for a long time," he confessed. "It's not just the isolation. It's you." I couldn't breathe, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I looked away, out of the tent's small window, where the moonlight bathed the world in silver. "We need to go back to sleep," I said firmly, trying to end the conversation. But he didn't move. Instead, he reached out again, cupping my cheek gently. "I don't want to pretend anymore," he said, his voice filled with a raw, aching honesty. Tears pricked at my eyes. "Mark, this isn't fair," I whispered. "You're confused. We're both confused." Maybe, he admitted, his thumb brushing away a tear that had slipped down my cheek. But I've never been more certain of how I feel. His lips hovered close to mine, and for one wild, reckless moment, I almost leaned in. I almost let myself forget who we were, almost surrendered to the emotions I had kept buried for so long. But then I pulled back, shaking my head. "This can't happen," I said, my voice breaking. "I love you, but not like this. I can't." He looked at me then, his face a mask of pain and resignation. "I'm sorry," he whispered, pulling away. "I didn't mean to make things harder." We lay back down, the space between us now feeling like a chasm. I stared up at the roof of the tent, my heart aching with a pain I couldn't name. I knew nothing would ever be the same after tonight. As dawn broke, casting a soft light over the campsite, I realized I was crying, silent tears that I couldn't stop. Mark was already awake, sitting by the dying embers of the fire, his back to me. He looked small, almost fragile, like the boy I had once comforted after a nightmare. I knew we had crossed a line, even if nothing had truly happened. The feelings we had acknowledged in the dark couldn't be taken back. And as I watched him sitting there, alone and lost, I felt a sorrow deeper than anything I'd ever known. The morning sun filtered through the thin canvas of the tent, casting a pale golden light over everything. I took a deep breath, willing the lump in my throat to dissolve, but it stayed lodged there, stubborn and unyielding. Outside, I could see Mark sitting with his back to me, his shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of the world. I knew we needed to talk, but I wasn't ready. Not yet. The silence between us felt fragile, like glass on the verge of shattering. I moved slowly, unzipping the tent as quietly as I could. The air was cold, but the chill was a welcome distraction from the whirlwind of emotions tearing through me. Mark didn't turn around when I joined him by the remnants of the campfire. He was poking at the ashes with a stick, absently stirring the charred remains. I watched him for a moment, noticing the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers clenched the stick tightly. He looked like a man fighting an internal battle, one I wasn't sure he could win. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was rough, edged with something that sounded like regret. "I shouldn't have said anything last night." I swallowed hard, sitting down beside him, though I kept a careful distance. "Mark," I began, but I couldn't find the right words. How was I supposed to respond? How could I tell him that I felt it too, that I wasn't as immune to the confusing tangle of emotions as I pretended to be? He turned to face me then, his eyes searching mine. "Please don't lie to me," he said quietly. "Not now." I looked away, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you want me to say?" I whispered. "That I'm not confused. That I haven't felt something I shouldn't feel." He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine, a touch so light it could have been an accident. But it wasn't. We both knew that. "Just tell me the truth," he pleaded. "Even if it's messy. Even if it hurts." I pulled my hand away, wrapping my arms around myself as if I could ward off the chill that had settled into my bones. "The truth is, I don't know what I'm feeling," I said, my voice barely audible. "You're my son, Mark. I raised you. I shouldn't. I can't." He flinched, as though my words had physically struck him. "You don't see me like that," he said, almost accusingly. "Not anymore." "I know you don't." My breath caught in my throat. He was right, and that was what terrified me the most. I had started to see him differently, not as the boy I had once comforted after scraped knees and nightmares, but as a man I could admire, a man who stirred something deep within me that I hadn't felt in years. I hated myself for it, for allowing those thoughts to even exist. "We need to leave," I said abruptly, standing up. "We can't stay here. It's not good for us." Mark's expression hardened. "Running away won't change what we feel," he said, his voice rising. "Pretending this didn't happen won't make it go away." "Stop," I snapped, more harshly than I intended. "You don't understand what you're saying. You're young. You're confused. Don't patronize me," he shot back, standing up as well. He was taller than me now, looking down with a mix of anger and desperation in his eyes. I know what I feel, and it's not just some fleeting crush. It's real, and you feel it too. I opened my mouth to argue, to deny it, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down I knew he was right. The connection between us had shifted, grown into something we couldn't explain or control. I wanted to tell him that it was just a moment of weakness, a side effect of being isolated here, away from the rest of the world. But I couldn't lie to him. Not anymore. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice breaking. I've tried to push these feelings away, but they keep coming back. And it scares me, Mark. It scares me because I don't want to hurt you, and I don't want to hurt myself. The anger melted from his expression, replaced by something softer, something sad. He took a step closer, hesitating as though afraid I might pull away. When I didn't, he reached out, gently cupping my face in his hand. I would never hurt you, he whispered. You know that, right? I closed my eyes, leaning into his touch despite every instinct screaming at me to stop. I know, I whispered back. But this isn't right. We can't do this. His thumb brushed against my cheek, wiping away a tear I hadn't realized had fallen. I don't care about right or wrong, he said, his voice raw. I just care about you. I opened my eyes then, meeting his gaze. There was no hiding from the truth anymore. The walls I had built around my heart were crumbling, and the only thing left was the aching, undeniable connection between us. We should go, I said again, but this time my voice lacked conviction. Please, he whispered, leaning closer. Just give me this moment. Let me hold you just once. I knew I should say no. I knew I should push him away and leave before we crossed a line we couldn't uncross. But instead I found myself nodding, giving in to the tidal wave of emotions I had kept bottled up for so long. He wrapped his arms around me, pulling me close. I buried my face in his chest, inhaling the familiar scent of him, a mix of pine and the faint hint of cologne he always wore. It felt safe, but it also felt dangerous, like standing on the edge of a cliff. For a long time we stood there in silence, holding on to each other as if the world might crumble around us. And maybe, in a way, it already had. I love you, he whispered into my hair. His voice filled with a tenderness that made my heart ache. I love you too, I replied, and the words felt like both a confession and a surrender. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a harsh light over the campsite, reality came crashing back in. I pulled away, stepping back and putting distance between us once more. We need to pack up and leave, I said, my voice hollow. We can't stay here anymore. Mark's face fell, but he nodded. Okay, he said quietly. But this isn't over. You know that, right? I didn't answer. Instead, I turned and walked away, blinking back the tears that blurred my vision. 'Cause he was right. This wasn't over. And no matter how far we ran, we couldn't escape the truth of what we had become. As we drove down the winding mountain road, the silence between us felt heavier than the thick fog that clung to the forest. I kept my eyes focused on the road ahead, but my mind was replaying the events of the past night over and over again. The way Mark had held me, the raw, unfiltered emotion in his voice when he whispered that he loved me. It was impossible to ignore. Every fiber of my being knew this wasn't right, but I also couldn't deny the warmth that spread through me at the memory. I stole a glance at him. He was staring out the window, his expression distant, almost melancholic. There was an unspoken understanding between us now, a new dynamic that neither of us knew how to navigate. It felt like we were suspended in a strange, in-between space, no longer just mother and son, yet not fully acknowledging the deeper, more complicated feelings that had surfaced. When we arrived back at the cabin we had rented for the rest of our trip, the air was still filled with tension. It was a small, rustic place nestled against the edge of the forest, isolated and serene. Normally, it would have felt like a perfect escape, but now it felt more like a cocoon, trapping us together with emotions that had no place to go. Mark grabbed the bags from the trunk, his movements deliberate and controlled. "I'll start unpacking," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Okay," I replied, my own voice strained, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile understanding we had formed. Inside, the cabin was dim and quiet, the only sound the faint creaking of the wooden floorboards beneath our feet. I busied myself with mundane tasks, putting away groceries, checking the fireplace, anything to distract myself from the suffocating silence. But I could feel his presence like a physical weight, hovering at the edge of my awareness. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to find him standing in the doorway, watching me with that same intense, searching look that had become all too familiar. "Mark, we need to talk about this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, stepping closer. "I know," he agreed. "But I don't want to keep talking in circles. I don't want to pretend we can go back to how things were." I felt a surge of panic, my heart pounding in my chest. "We have to," I insisted, though the words sounded hollow even to me. "We can't. It's not possible." He stepped closer, closing the distance between us until I could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Why isn't it possible?" he asked, his voice low, almost pleading. "Because it's wrong. Because it's not what people expect." "Yes," I snapped, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Yes, because it's wrong. You're my son, Mark. I raised you." His face twisted into a pained expression. "You raised me, but you're not my biological mother," he said softly. "I know it sounds like I'm making excuses, but it's different. We're different." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "It doesn't matter," I said, though my resolve was slipping. "We can't be like this." Mark reached out then, taking my hand in his. His touch was gentle, but there was an urgency behind it. "Tell me you don't feel it," he said, his eyes boring into mine. "Tell me you don't feel this connection, this closeness." I wanted to tell him no, to lie and say I felt nothing. But the words caught in my throat. Couldn't do it. The truth was staring me in the face, and denying it felt like trying to hold back the tide with my bare hands. Instead, I squeezed his hand, a silent admission of everything I was too afraid to say. He let out a shaky breath, as if he'd been holding it in for years. "I knew it," he whispered. "I knew I wasn't imagining this." We stood there, holding each other's gaze, the air thick with the unspoken. Slowly, he lifted my hand to his lips, pressing a soft, almost reverent kiss to my knuckles. It was such a tender gesture, filled with a kind of affection I hadn't felt in years. My heart ached with the depth of it, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "Mark," I began, but he cut me off with a quiet, "Sure." He stepped closer until there was no space left between us. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me into an embrace that felt both comforting and dangerous. I buried my face in his chest, inhaling the familiar scent of him. It was like coming home, a place of warmth and safety I hadn't realized I'd been missing. But beneath the comfort was something darker, something I couldn't ignore. "We shouldn't do this," I whispered against his shirt, though I made no move to pull away. He rested his chin on top of my head, his voice soft and filled with longing. "Maybe we shouldn't," he agreed. "But we are." The rest of the day passed in a haze. We moved through the cabin together, cooking dinner side by side, the silence between us no longer awkward but filled with a new kind of intimacy. Every glance, every touch felt charged, heavy with meaning. I caught him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking, and each time, his gaze sent a shiver down my spine. That night, as we settled on the couch to watch a movie, he pulled me close, draping his arm around my shoulders. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a claim, like he was staking his place beside me. I leaned into him, telling myself it was just for comfort, just for warmth. But I knew better. Halfway through the movie, he turned his head and pressed a kiss to my temple. It was soft, almost innocent, but it lingered longer than it should have. My breath hitched, and I turned to face him. His eyes searched mine, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then he cupped my face in his hands, his touch featherlight, as if he were afraid I might pull away. "I love you," he whispered, the words filled with a raw, aching sincerity. "I love you too," I replied, and this time there was no hesitation. Slowly, as if giving me every chance to stop him, he leaned in. His lips brushed against mine, tentative and questioning. It was the softest kiss, a whisper of contact, but it ignited something deep inside me. I closed my eyes, leaning into him, letting the kiss deepen. In that moment, the rest of the world fell away. There was only us, suspended in a bubble of warmth and affection that felt more real than anything I'd ever known. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathing heavily, my heart pounding in my chest. "We can't go back," I said, my voice trembling. Mark nodded, his forehead pressed against mine. "I don't want to," he whispered. And as he pulled me back into his arms, I realized I didn't want to either.
Bye.